Welcome to the official YouTube channel for the Colin Cowherd podcast. Go on, hit the subscribe button. There you go, right down there. If you want to be among the first to hear my weekly takes, NFL, college football, more, right there. The football season is over for the Jets and the Giants, and I saw a quote that was so damning with the Jets. So somebody asked Mecole Hardman, the kid who went to Kansas City, he goes to New York, it just doesn't work, and he goes back to Kansas City, and, he has a pretty good Super Bowl.
Of course he can.
Of course he does, right?
Of course he does.
And, I've been on this for a couple of years, and I know you don't probably listen to a lot of sports radio, but I've been on something for 2 years hard, that the world's changed, that Belichick is allergic to offense, tone deaf to it, that it's the last 10 to 12 Super Bowl coaches have all been offense. Is that overwhelmingly offensive coaches, 75 to 80% of playoff teams have offensive coaches. So if an offensive coach loses a great offensive coordinator, there's no chaos. They're fine. McVay can run through them. Shanahan can run through them. Andy Reid can run through them. Sean Payton. But if a defensive coach loses a sharp OC, it's a problem. And so you have Robert Saleh, who I like, and he did play I think he coached a little bit of offense at some point in his career. But it was really damning. They asked Mecole Hardman about his Jet experience. And I read this and I went, holy crap, this is a bad look. He said there's no standardized set of offense for the Jets. It's, hey, we've got Aaron, he'll figure it out. He said there's no question there are standards and protocols for defense. It's a defensive culture. He goes, offense, we just make it up. And he goes, once Aaron got hurt, it was just not viable. What are the standards under Nat Hackett, who was hired because of Aaron Rodgers? And I think there was a belief when the Jets got Aaron that this was kind of going to be a better version of Favre. And I actually think it's a worse version because I think the Achilles surgery changes everything. They're locked in for another year. And Favre you didn't have to bring in people to appease Favre, like a Hackett or a Cobb or an Alan Lazard. It felt like, Favre wanted to get out and the Jets landed him, whereas Aaron kind of accompanied the Jets and brought people with him. I look at the offensive line. I look at Breece Hall. Hopefully you cross his fingers, he's healthy. I look at the offensive pivot by the league and a defensive coach on the hot seat. The impulsiveness of the Johnsons as owners. Like, I don't think it's going to end well for Aaron Rodgers. I think it's false hope. That Mecole Hardman bite was just an eye-opener to the circus inside the building. Do you have optimism with the Jets at all?
Well, I'm writing a book on Aaron Rodgers, so I have to have optimism. And it's supposed to come out at the start of the season. So I would like the Jets to defy what you just said. Do I really believe it deep down? I don't know. When my books, I look at my previous subjects, and my book comes out on Derek Jeter. He becomes the first Yankee to get to 3,000 hits and does it with a home run on a 5-for-5 day. Belichick when my book came out, won his 6th and final Super Bowl. Coach K broke John Wooden's record with his 13th Final Four appearance. So, listen, at some point, and everything you said is true. Aaron Rodgers as a GM He was not going to be voted executive of the year off that performance, even if he played. But I do think if he played, some of those guys, Lazard certainly would have been better, and Cobb, I think, would have been more useful, and Hackett would have been better. He couldn't be any worse. So that was just being in that building that night when he got hurt. I've just never been in a building where there was that sort of heartbreak in a crowd. It was unfathomable, but only the Jets. That was an only New York Jet moment. And so here's the thing. And the Red Sox fans before 2004 thought they could never, ever win another World Series, particularly after what happened in 2003 when Aaron Boone walked them off in Game 7. The franchise that had tormented them for decades did it again in 2003. They come back. They're down 0-3 in 2004, and they win the whole thing. They end the curse of the Bambino. The Cubs in 2016, those fans thought it's never going to happen, and it did happen. So at some point, haunted franchises usually will break through. So is it possible that the Jets had to bottom out with this horrific season? 7-10 doesn't sound terrible, But that
Right.
was a terrible season. The only saving grace was beating Belichick, breaking that 15-game winning streak he had against the Jets, and sending him out of Foxborough with a loss. Other than that, it was a disaster. And it felt more like 4-13. So is it possible they bottom out and they come back and they have the season that they were supposed to have last year, this coming season, maybe go 11-6 with an easier schedule and lower expectations and win a game or two in the tournament? I think that's feasible. Winning the whole thing, it's going to happen at some point. Hopefully, I think you and I are about the same age. Hopefully, when we're alive, that will happen. I really want to see that happen. It doesn't have to be this coming season, and it probably won't be. But the New York Jets winning a Super Bowl again for the first time since January '69, for the first time since Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, would be the biggest sports story in my 40 plus years of covering sports in New York, I think. I think it's bigger than Messier in '94. I think it would become bigger than Namath in Super Bowl III, although that changed professional football just because of the media age we live in. Just think of how big, if they won it this coming season with Aaron Rodgers at age 41 in December, he turns 41, coming off an Achilles. I think that would be the biggest story in my 38 to 40 years of doing sports in New York.
All right. I know there are certain boundaries you want to protect on this Aaron Rodgers book. Is he willing to talk? Can I ask that?
He did talk to me recently. I visited him and for a couple hours, and it was a very healthy, I think, and respectful give and take. I don't know how he'd classify it, but yeah, and it wasn't, listen, I would have loved 10 hours with the guy, so it wasn't like full cooperation. This is an unauthorized book. It's my book, not his. And so it's more like after all these interviews, let's check some facts here. I want to make sure I'm getting things right. And it was a sit down. That was the spirit of it. And I was grateful that he did that. He certainly didn't owe me anything. So I recently did that. And so I think it will be a definitive and fair and honest and accurate account of who he is, why he is the way he is. And I had so many people, Peter King, one of them, the best ever. I think Peter is the best ever at what he does. Say he knows Aaron Rodgers, but I don't know him. And I think there are so many really smart football people who tell me they don't feel like they've got a firm grasp on who he is. So that was my objective, was to try to explain who he is, and hopefully I pulled it off.
Let me throw something at you that, years ago, I can remember my dad, who was more of a Reagan conservative. Um, you know, it was considered healthy. It could be Abby Hoffman. It could be anybody that pushed back on authority. That was considered sort of healthy. It was mostly left leaners against authority, against wealth, against power. Now, the conservatives would argue we're pushing back against power, and power is not only our government, but it's the media in Silicon Valley, there's certainly a point there to be made. When I have tried to do Psych 101 with Aaron Rodgers, I've said this on the air. I'm not a psychologist, but he pushed back on his parents and religion. He pushed back on authority in Green Bay. He has pushed back on the vaccine. He's pushed back on media. He's pushed back. He's a bit of a contrarian that maybe he is, he's our modern day rebel. Is that if you look at his personality, what he does is constantly push back on conventional mandates, conventional wisdom, conventional authority. That's my interpretation. He just pushes back on groupthink. Now, sometimes groupthink is correct. I think people should have taken the vaccine if they were older, right? Kids, maybe not as much. Is that a fair or reasonable interpretation of what you're discovering? Is that, he's never married, no kids, may not, I don't know of his pet situation. He's really an independent guy. He's wealthy, good looking, older. He's got his worldview. It's a lot like Joe Rogan's. They're both talented. But he basically just pushes back on authority. Maybe one of the reasons he's not married. He doesn't want to conform. And that's his personality. That's his id. Is that reasonable?
Reasonable. He certainly pushes back on an awful lot of fronts. And I think growing up in a very strict religious household is certainly part of it, maybe the beginning of when you grow up in a household like that, I think maybe naturally later on, and he goes to Cal, this liberal global institution, people from all over the world, and he's experiencing different cultures and backgrounds and ethnicities and races. And he grew up in a town that was overwhelmingly white. And so I think you start to see it maybe at Cal Berkeley. And I think he starts pushing back maybe against the religious upbringing, and that leads to other pushback. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of the journey of his life and where he is right now. And I think that's the one thing about him that I admire, even though I don't agree with everything he says, is he is pretty fearless. He's not afraid to confront uh, opposition and to say unpopular things and to deal with the consequences of those things. And I think that's an admirable trait. I don't think that he's doing it just for that reason, just to push back. I do think he believes in what he says, but I think it's a good read on the journey of Aaron Rodgers. And I did ask him I asked him, for instance, when he said I've been immunized, and then he got killed for that later on, of course, when it came out that he did not get the vaccine, and he explained why he said what he said. And he was allergic to an ingredient in Moderna and Pfizer, and also concerned about the side effects, the reported alleged side effects of the Johnson and Johnson shot. Is why didn't you just say that in August of that year when you gave that press conference, instead of saying I've been immunized and sort of misleading people? And I thought his answer to that, which I'd like to say for the book, was very interesting.
Yeah.
And because if I were sitting there as a columnist, I don't know how you feel, Colin, about vaccines, and I got vaccinated, and
yeah.
But I'd put myself sort of in the middle on it, because I do think it was not quite as effective as it was advertised. And I got COVID twice. And so I said, if you gave that explanation about being allergic and also being concerned about side effects, I think that's a reasonable explanation. I would have accepted it. Unlike Kyrie Irving, who could not play because of the mandate in New York, you could play with that position. And my biggest problem with Kyrie Irving is what he was doing to his teammates, and particularly Kevin Durant, but also to middle and bottom of the roster players whose careers were being affected and could be elevated by winning a championship that they had no chance of winning with him not playing. So Aaron Rodgers didn't have to deal with that. He was eligible to play with the position of not taking the vaccine. But I think if I were sitting there as a columnist and he gave the explanation he gave months later, I would have thought that was reasonable.
Yeah, I view you as a storyteller. I think you're a great American sports storyteller, and that's what I value. Yeah, I mean, your books, I've read them all. And I can't wait for this. Aaron Rodgers, that's a really, part of this book writing thing is the topic. I tell people this all the time in my business. You can be the greatest sports talk show host of all time. You choose hockey, I choose football, I win the segment. It doesn't matter how great you are, how average I am. Topic matters. And right now, I can't wait to read the Aaron Rodgers book. I can't. That's a great topic. I can't, because nobody's really done the seminal book on him, because he's been a little bit elusive. He's a little bit prickly. He can be a tad aloof, and he's not that giving. Teammates don't know him. He's not that giving. So do you know the name for it yet?
Out of the Darkness. The mystery. The mystery of Aaron Rodgers is sort of the subtitle, but he has said those words, out of the darkness. I came out of the darkness. It was more last year than I guess this year. But when he went on that darkness retreat and came outside, he still wanted to play. Then he wanted to play for the Jets. And so the idea is to bring light to the mystery of who he is. And so that's why that title was picked. And so you're not a huge fan of his as a figure, right? As a personality.
Well, I think first ballot Hall of Famer. Would always choose him over Favre. I thought he was more efficient and more of a thinking man's player. I consider him like A-Rod or Kevin Durant, an all-time great talent, not a great leader, little passive-aggressive. Jeter's more leader. Brady's more leader. And I think there's a distinction between the two. I think LeBron has leadership qualities. Steph Curry does. I think Kawhi Leonard's just great. And so we tend to think quarterbacks all have to be great leaders. Manning certainly was. He was very confrontational with Jeff Saturday, Brady with a coordinator, Mahomes with a coach. That's not Aaron. But I do think he's a fascinating personality. He's a content machine. He's a contrarian, and I appreciate him. I think he suffers from a little bit of that smartest guy in the room disease.
Oh yeah, no doubt about
Old,
that.
rich, single, doesn't really have to sacrifice for kids, a family. You know what I mean? Like you when you're married, it's a series of sacrifices. I'm willing to do all of them, but it's a different lifestyle than Aaron. And I think, Bill Simmons and I have talked about this. Older, richer, handsome, never married. You kind of get into your own you get into your mirror a lot. You are the sun, the galaxy, and the stars. And I think there's a bit of that that's a little over the top, but I respect the hell out of him.
Oh, it's interesting because the Jets, the players love him to death.
Yeah.
And I think most of them did in Green Bay. He had two guys, Greg Jennings and Jermichael Finley, who had some negative things to say about him and his leadership style and approach over the years. But it's really kind of just those two guys. And I had a prominent NFL figure. I used this quote in the book, but I'll give it to you now. I didn't name the person because he said, listen, I can't stand Aaron Rodgers and everything he stands for, particularly on the vaccine. And this is somebody who's done a lot of business with the Packers and the Jets, prominent NFL figure. And he said, but I have to admit, I've never met an NFL player who doesn't like him. So in the locker room, he's loved in a lot of
Yeah.
corners. And so Hard Knocks was very good for him. I think it became an Aaron Rodgers infomercial, really, in terms of how he connected with players, older players, younger players, and how they responded to him. So we'll see. We'll see how the season plays out. I just want him to be healthy. I
Yeah.
just want to see the season. I just want to see him make 15 starts. And because I've covered some of his games here and there, but I've never seen a full Aaron Rodgers season. I'd love to see it in my backyard with the Jets. And if he could win a championship with the Jets, which is unlikely, that would do a tremendous amount for his legacy. I think right now I'd have him fifth all time on the quarterback list. I
Yeah.
think he could probably move up to two or three, and with a Super Bowl victory with the Jets. I'd probably put Brady's one, Mahomes two, Montana three, Peyton Manning four. I'd have Rodgers five. But I think he can move up a step or two if he wins one with the Jets.
Yeah. I have Brady, Mahomes, Montana, Peyton, Elway. And then I think you get into the next four or five guys. He's in that discussion. Absolutely.
So you have
Um,
more like seven, eight,
Yeah, I have him
nine.
more
Yeah.
like eight, but I always preferred him over Favre, who I thought was reckless, not as coachable, was more instinct driven, which I understood John Madden's affection for him, but I like guys who are more kind of buttoned up on script and take the layups and not everything is sort of, I'm going to do it my way. I think that's a very outdated way to play football.